Israel added an Iranian leader to its hit list. Trump denied this. Here's what really happened. Within a 72-hour period, three governments took steps that, when considered individually, might seem like routine diplomatic noise. But when viewed together, these steps reveal almost everything about the current state of this conflict. Israel's defense minister had declared Iran's supreme leader a target during an official ceremony. Within a day, following reports that Israeli jets had entered Iranian airspace, an Iranian diplomatic plane was forced to make an emergency landing. And a day later, the US president personally intervened to deny this threat, specifically to salvage the nuclear negotiations, which were already on the brink of collapse. Here's what no one is talking about. The person at the center of all these events hasn't appeared in front of cameras for more than 4 months. We believe the reason for this is even more significant than the threat itself. Keep listening, because what the Iranian parliament did this week is protecting something far more dangerous than any single leader. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Stay tuned for more news. Something genuinely extraordinary happened in the past 48 hours, and the coverage of it has been so fractured and so contradictory that most people following this conflict do not have a coherent picture of what actually occurred or what it means for where this entire situation goes next. So let's build that picture properly, all of it, piece by piece. Because when you put these pieces next to each other, in the correct order, with the correct timing, the picture that emerges is far more alarming than any single headline from the past 3 days has suggested. On July 1st, Israel's defense minister publicly declared Iran's supreme leader a marked target for elimination. That is not a paraphrase. That is not an interpretation of ambiguous language. It is a direct characterization of a formal public statement, delivered at a military ceremony that was prepared in advance, with full awareness of the audience that would receive it. The defense minister said the supreme leader is marked. He said Israel has already struck Iran twice. He said a third strike remains on the table. He said all of this on the record, at a public event that was broadcast and transcribed in full. On July 2nd, there were reports that Israeli aircraft entered Iranian airspace from the direction of Iraq, while an Iranian diplomatic delegation was in transit between the Doha negotiations and Tehran. That delegation made an emergency landing at an Iranian airport rather than continuing on its planned direct route, and subsequently completed its journey to Tehran by land under protection rather than by air. On July 3rd, President Trump publicly walked back the Israeli threat. He issued a clear, direct statement that the United States is not going to kill Iran's supreme leader, confirming this is not something that is going to happen, and doing so specifically to stabilize the nuclear negotiations in Doha that Israel's declaration had directly threatened to derail. 3 days. One of America's closest allies publicly marking the leader of a country, Washington, is simultaneously trying to negotiate a nuclear deal with. A demonstration of Israeli operational reach that forced an Iranian diplomatic delegation to land early and complete a sensitive mission by road. And then the American president personally intervening to pull the threat back from the table in real time. If you want to understand the actual shape of this conflict as it stands right now, that 3-day sequence tells you more than any single military operation or diplomatic announcement, since the memorandum was signed 16 days ago. Let's start with what Israel's declaration actually was, because the surface reading of it as simply another escalatory threat misses the specific operational and political logic behind it. And missing that logic means missing the most important thing happening in this conflict right now. Israel's defense minister did not make a casual remark at a press conference. He made a formal public statement at a military memorial ceremony. That distinction matters enormously. Ceremonies of that kind carry specific institutional weight inside Israeli security culture. Statements made there are prepared, reviewed by legal and security advisors, cleared through appropriate governmental channels, and delivered with the full understanding that they will be treated as official policy rather than personal opinion. The venue was chosen, not stumbled into. The specific language used, that the supreme leader is marked, that 2 strikes have already occurred, that a third remains possible, is the vocabulary of operational designation rather than political rhetoric. In Israeli security culture, the phrase marked for elimination describes a targeting decision that has entered the planning process, not merely a threat existing in the rhetorical domain. But here's the part nobody is talking about. To understand why this declaration was made at this precise moment, you have to look at what was happening simultaneously on the nuclear negotiation track. Iran's parliament had just passed a law specifically prohibiting inspection access to bombed nuclear sites. Iran's parliament speaker and chief nuclear negotiator had gone on state television to call reports of a nuclear inspection agreement a lie. Iran's foreign ministry was simultaneously issuing statements describing the Doha talks as making positive progress. And Iran's military was simultaneously warning that all oil tankers must use Iranian-approved routes or face an immediate and forceful response. Israel's declaration was not made in a vacuum. It was a response to a specific and observable pattern. Iran's parliament had just legislated away the single most important verification requirement in the entire American negotiating position, while its foreign ministry was characterizing the negotiations as going well. What Israel communicated, delivered to every relevant audience simultaneously, was this: if the diplomatic track is being used as cover for establishing legislative and institutional facts that make nuclear verification permanently impossible, there is another track available. And the person at the formal apex of Iran's decision-making structure needs to understand that his physical security is now part of that calculation. That message has specific audiences beyond the obvious one. It is addressed to Iran's supreme leader directly, whoever and wherever he currently is. It is addressed to the IRGC's hardline factions, who have been acting with apparent independence from Iran's formal negotiating position, signaling that the costs of continued defiance extend beyond the individuals making specific operational decisions to the entire leadership structure they operate under. It is addressed to Washington as a reminder that Israel's operational timeline is not subordinate to the American diplomatic calendar. And it is addressed to Iranian pragmatic negotiators sitting in Doha, providing them with a specific, immediate, and deeply personal argument for why closing a genuine deal quickly serves their own survival interests, not just national economic interests. And that's where this story changes, because the Iranian diplomatic delegation's emergency landing adds a specific operational dimension to this broader strategic messaging. Getting a diplomatic aircraft to land early by simply entering its airspace is a demonstration of capability that requires no kinetic action and creates no casualties, while communicating an extremely precise message. You are trackable. You are reachable. The infrastructure protecting your diplomatic movement is insufficient to prevent Israeli reach into Iranian airspace. The people in those aircraft completed their return to Tehran by road, which means they had hours to think about exactly what that interception meant and what it implied about every other movement their leadership makes. President Trump's rapid public intervention to walk back the threat revealed several things simultaneously, and this is where things become far more complicated than a simple story of an ally overstepping. First, there was insufficient coordination between Washington and Jerusalem on the timing and content of the Israeli declaration. That is itself a significant data point about the current state of American-Israeli operational synchronization on this specific dimension of the conflict. If Washington had been fully briefed in advance and had approved the declaration, there would have been no need to publicly walk it back within 48 hours. Second, the administration assessed that the Israeli declaration was operationally dangerous to something Washington is currently trying to protect. The speed of the public response indicates genuine urgency about preventing the Doha process from collapsing, which tells you the administration believes that process remains viable and worth protecting. If Washington had privately concluded that talks were already failing, the urgency to walk back a threat that complicated them would have been considerably lower. Third, and this is the detail most coverage completely missed, Trump's public statement is necessarily a statement about American intentions, not Israeli intentions. The President of the United States cannot commit Israel to a course of action any more than Israel's defense minister can commit the United States to one. This is understood by every party watching the situation, including Iran's leadership. Washington has said it will not pursue this option. Jerusalem has said it might. Both statements remain simultaneously true. What this creates is a specific and deliberate strategic ambiguity that benefits the American negotiating position in ways worth examining carefully. Iran cannot discount the Israeli threat simply because Washington has walked it back. If Iran believed that the American statement fully neutralized the Israeli declaration, the pressure that declaration was designed to create would evaporate entirely. Iran has to continue operating with the awareness that Israel's operational decision-making is not fully subordinate to Washington's diplomatic preferences. The ambiguity itself functions as a negotiating tool, even if it emerged from insufficient coordination rather than deliberate design. Now let's talk about what Iran's supreme leader's situation actually looks like, because the person at the center of both Israel's threat and Washington's reassurance is himself an extraordinarily opaque figure, and his actual condition and decision-making capacity remain genuinely uncertain in ways that have direct implications for whether any negotiated deal can actually be delivered by the regime that would need to implement it. The current supreme leader was elevated to his position following his father's elimination in the strikes of February 28, 2026. He is the nominal head of the Islamic Republic. In theory, his authority supersedes the IRGC command structure, the parliament, the foreign ministry, and the entire governmental apparatus. In practice, the observable evidence about how he is actually functioning tells a story that is considerably more complicated and considerably more concerning from a stability standpoint than the official Iranian narrative suggests. He has not appeared on camera in over 4 months. Iranian state media has been running archival footage and imagery rather than current documentation. There have been reports suggesting AI-generated content is being used to maintain the appearance of a functioning leadership presence, because authentic current footage simply does not exist in sufficient quantity to sustain the narrative. The Iranian public has not verifiably seen their supreme leader on camera since before the February strikes. American and Israeli intelligence officials have provided characterizations, reported in major publications, indicating the supreme leader was wounded, cut off, and initially unresponsive to communications following the February 28 strike. Reports drawing on intelligence assessments suggested injuries requiring multiple surgical interventions. Iran's official position is that he experienced only a minor injury and is in perfect health, exercising full command authority. The evidence for that claim is 0 verifiable public appearances across 4 months. His physical security architecture reflects the regime's genuine awareness that he remains a priority target. Officials summoned to meet with him reportedly travel the final portion of their journey in blacked-out vehicles, taken through tunnel systems while blindfolded, unable to reconstruct the route afterward. The tunnel network reportedly runs under schools, hospitals, mosques, and residential neighborhoods, specifically because strikes there would require collateral damage assessments that complicate Western targeting decisions. His location is protected not just by distance and construction, but by the legal and moral costs any strike would impose on the attacker. Here's the real question, and it's the one that should be keeping analysts up at night. The man who is supposed to be making the decisions that will determine whether Iran's parliamentary inspection ban is reversed or maintained, whether the IRGC's hardline factions are directed toward genuine compliance or continued defiance, and whether the Doha talks produce a genuine final agreement before the 60-day window expires, is operating from inside a blindfolded courier tunnel network, with injuries whose severity remains publicly unconfirmed. Now let's connect this to the parliamentary inspection ban, because it represents the single most consequential development of the entire post-ceasefire period, and the one that most directly implicates whether this conflict achieves its stated objectives. Iran's parliament passed legislation specifically prohibiting inspection access to bombed or damaged nuclear sites under any circumstances. The sites specifically protected by this legislation are Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. These are not peripheral facilities. These are the core of Iran's nuclear program, the sites where enrichment happened, where centrifuges operated, and where the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator strikes during Operation Midnight Hammer, and subsequent strikes during Operation Epic Fury in February 2026 were specifically targeted. These are the sites where the approximately 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium that the entire nuclear negotiation is supposed to account for was located. Without inspection access to these specific sites, no external party can determine whether that enriched material has been destroyed, relocated, partially salvaged, or is being reconstituted. The ambiguity about what survived those strikes cannot be resolved without someone physically going inside and looking. Iran has now made that physically going inside and looking domestically illegal. The mechanism matters as much as the outcome. Passing a law is considerably harder to reverse than a negotiating position, because it requires parliamentary action to undo rather than simply a different diplomatic formulation. Iran's hardline parliamentary majority can block any reversal attempt procedurally, regardless of what the executive foreign policy apparatus might prefer to offer in a Doha negotiating session. The inspection ban has been insulated from executive reversal by the same parliamentary process that created it. This is exactly the kind of fact-creating action we've been tracking throughout the post-ceasefire period. The Persian Gulf Strait Authority created within days of the memorandum's signing, the permit requirements for commercial shipping in the Northern Corridor, the declarations that Hormuz operates under Iranian rather than international maritime authority. Each converted a diplomatic position into an institutional fact harder to undo than it was to create. The inspection ban is the most consequential of these because it forecloses the one deliverable the entire military campaign was designed to produce. The cost of Operation Midnight Hammer, Operation Epic Fury, the naval blockade, the carrier strike groups deployed, and the American personnel casualties whose exact figures remain classified. All of that was paid in service of eliminating Iran's nuclear weapons capability in verifiable form. The parliamentary inspection ban is Iran's method of ensuring that verification never happens, while collecting the economic benefits of the memorandum that were supposed to come in exchange for exactly that verification. But that's not the most important part. Because the ban may be more fragile than it looks, and the reason why brings us to something almost nobody outside specialist circles has been covering. The Kurdish insurgency in the western Zagros mountain provinces is consuming IRGC ground forces and organizational bandwidth in a second operational theater the regime did not expect to manage alongside the Strait of Hormuz situation and the nuclear negotiations. Coordinated multi-province attacks across more than 200 kilometers of mountain terrain, using small ISR drones and FPV attack systems, are creating a genuine second front the IRGC's historical counterinsurgency toolkit was not designed to address. Urban resistance networks in Tehran, Isfahan, and Tabriz activated a coordinated poster and graffiti campaign in late June, demonstrating organizational coherence well beyond spontaneous protest. These networks have shown the ability to coordinate timing across multiple cities simultaneously, a capability suggesting either external support or significant internal organizational development. The IRGC's senior naval commander, the one most closely associated with strait closure enforcement, died on a highway in southeastern Iran in late June, under circumstances Iranian authorities explicitly urged the public not to speculate about. That specific pattern, a warning against speculation issued by the IRGC's own media platform, follows what analysts have historically identified as the Iranian regime's standard approach to sensitive eliminations. It cannot publicly attribute or acknowledge without triggering mandatory escalatory responses. The Supreme Leader himself is operating from underground tunnel networks with injuries of uncertain severity, exercising whatever command authority he retains through blindfolded courier protocols that American officials have reportedly described as resembling near-total organizational dysfunction. And now, layered on top of all of this, an Israeli defense minister has publicly declared this supreme leader a marked target, and Israeli aircraft have demonstrated the ability to approach Iranian diplomatic aircraft in transit within Iranian airspace. The intersection of all of these simultaneous pressures is what makes the inspection ban specifically important to watch in the coming days. Despite its current apparent legal solidity, a parliament can pass a law under one set of circumstances and find itself facing overwhelming pressure to revise it under a very different set of circumstances. The factions that passed this law did so in a political environment where the regime still appeared to have sufficient internal coherence and external leverage to sustain its defiant posture. If the Kurdish insurgency escalates further, if the supreme leader's command authority continues to appear unclear, if economic pressure from any reimposed enforcement measures begins to bite again, and if the Israeli threat creates genuine uncertainty about the survival of the leadership figures who benefit from the current legislative stance, the political calculation that produced the inspection ban may shift considerably faster than conventional legislative analysis would suggest. Now let's examine the technical state of the nuclear program itself, because this is ultimately what everything else is being structured around. The enrichment infrastructure at Fordo and Natanz absorbed GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator strikes, specifically targeting the deepest vulnerable points of those facilities. A double-tap technique, delivering two weapons in sequence to the same coordinate to maximize combined penetration depth, was specifically employed to address the granite mountain geology at Fordo. Post-strike seismic monitoring detected ground motion signatures consistent with deep detonations rather than surface-level explosions, suggesting the weapons performed as designed. But here is the genuine uncertainty the inspection ban is specifically designed to protect. The Isfahan facility, which absorbed different strike types than Fordo because its underground geometry requires different approach angles, reportedly saw truck movement near tunnel entrances in the weeks before the strike window. Satellite imagery captured what appeared to be loading activity, consistent with material being moved into tunnels or between tunnel systems immediately before the strikes occurred. That material, if it was moved before the strikes, would not necessarily have been present in the chambers that were actually hit. The WC-135R Constant Phoenix nuclear sniffer aircraft, designed to detect atmospheric signatures of radioactive material being processed or handled, has been operating continuously in the region since before the first strikes. It detects that nuclear material activity exists without requiring physical site access. But it does not tell you with precision where that material currently is, how much exists, or what condition the centrifuge infrastructure is actually in. Those questions require someone physically inside those facilities. The inspection ban prevents exactly that. Nobody is allowed to go find out where the material is or in what condition. This is the strategic logic behind the inspection ban. Permanent ambiguity about what survived and what capability for reconstitution exists is itself a form of deterrence. If the international community cannot verify Iran's program has been truly eliminated, it cannot be fully confident it has been. That uncertainty imposes caution on any future military decision-making, even absent verified capability, because the cost of being wrong is catastrophic. Iran is converting the uncertain survival of some portion of its nuclear capability into permanent strategic ambiguity that functions as deterrence even if the actual surviving capability is minimal. The vote did not protect existing capability. It protected the ambiguity about whether any capability survived at all. Now, let's talk about what actually happens next, because the remaining days of this 60-day window will be the most consequential in this entire conflict's history, and the decision matrix available to each party is both specific and important to understand. Washington has three primary options available in the remaining window. Option 1 is accepting managed ambiguity, extending the timeline, treating the inspection ban as a diplomatic problem rather than a deal breaker, allowing economic normalization to continue while seeking incremental verification progress through partial access to non-bombed facilities as a face-saving compromise. This preserves the diplomatic track, but functionally lets Iran collect the memorandum's economic benefits without delivering the verification that was supposed to be the American gain. Option 2 is making the ban a genuine deal-breaker, telling Tehran and the Doha mediators that economic benefits will be frozen and enforcement reimposed if the ban isn't reversed within a specific time frame, using the maintained naval posture as leverage. This uses pressure deliberately kept in reserve, but risks collapsing the framework entirely if Iran responds with defiance. Option 3 is coordinating more explicitly with Israel rather than publicly distancing from it, allowing Israeli operational freedom on the targeting question to create parallel pressure. Washington maintains deniability about while privately not preventing. This uses the ambiguity of U.S.-Israel coordination as leverage, without requiring Washington to directly threaten what it has just publicly ruled out. Each of these options carries significant costs and risks. None of them is obviously correct. The one that is chosen, whether through deliberate decision or through the accumulation of smaller choices over the coming days, will define what the February 28th conflict actually achieved. Iran's options are more constrained, but still meaningful. Iran can reverse the inspection ban through parliamentary action, which requires both executive direction and sufficient votes to overcome the hardline majority that passed it. Given the internal pressure picture just described, this is more possible than it appears on the surface, if the right combination of inducements and threats is structured. Iran can offer limited inspection access to non-bombed sites as a partial compliance measure, presented publicly as a concession while leaving the core question of the bombed sites unresolved. This middle path is likely Iran's preferred outcome, since it appears to offer something while protecting the ambiguity that serves as the nuclear program's remaining deterrent value. Or, Iran can simply run out the clock, accepting whatever consequences come with the window's expiration and betting that American domestic political considerations, European economic interests in Iranian oil, and Chinese diplomatic pressure will prevent a return to the full enforcement posture that drove Iran to the negotiating table in the first place. What happens in the next 30 days will determine which of these paths each party chooses, and whether the choices made are adequate to produce the outcome that the entire cost of this conflict was supposed to purchase. Let's put the whole picture together one final time, because it deserves to be said plainly, without the press release language either side is using. Israel's defense minister said the supreme leader is marked. Trump said that is not going to happen. Iran's parliament passed a law making inspection access illegal. The Doha talks are supposedly making progress that nobody can specifically describe. 30 days remain on a 60-day clock that started with higher hopes than the current situation justifies. The enriched uranium is somewhere in the Iranian mountain network. The constant Phoenix is still detecting it. Nobody's allowed to go see where it actually is. The man responsible for the government that passed the law preventing anyone from looking is running that government through blindfolded couriers and underground tunnels, while an Israeli defense minister has publicly said he is a marked target. This is the actual state of the most consequential nuclear negotiation of this decade, as it stands right now. Not what either side's press releases say it is, what the observable facts say it is. The next 30 days will tell us whether the military campaign that cost everything it cost actually achieved its stated objective, or whether it produced an expensive pause that Iran has used to legally entrench the ambiguity it needs to eventually reconstitute what it lost. Watch the inspection ban specifically. Watch whether it gets reversed, quietly amended, or remains fully intact as the window expires. That single data point will tell you more about whether this conflict produced a genuine outcome than any statement from any government about the progress of any negotiating round. The clock is running, the tunnels are being watched, the constant Phoenix is still in the air, and in rooms nobody can see. On both sides of this conflict, the most important decisions of the entire post-ceasefire period are being made right now, this week, without most of the world watching closely enough to notice until the consequences are already impossible to reverse. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think happens to that inspection ban in the next 30 days, and whether you believe Iran's supreme leader is actually exercising meaningful command authority right now, or whether the system is running largely on institutional momentum. That question matters more than it sounds like it should, because everything downstream of it, the nuclear verification, the Hormuz standoff, the survival of the memorandum itself, depends on whether there is a coherent decision-maker actually in the room when the choices get made. If you're not subscribed yet, this is the moment. Hit the bell because the next 30 days are going to move fast, and we will be here covering every single development as it happens.